Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast, where we love all of our differences and how we can bring those to the table and make a difference together. It's so great to have you on the show today. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for writing this book. We're going to dig into that. But my first question for you is just, we have people from all different backgrounds and perspectives, differing abilities, different, racial groups, different genders, different language backgrounds and perspectives that come onto our podcast. And so maybe this is a great chance for you to tell us a little bit about what makes you unique and different and who is Sarah.
Oh no. Um, so I think something that makes me unique is that I'm an agnostic who loves talking to people about religion. I'm mostly a religion reporter, so I've spent a lot of these last few years where people have kind of separated out into their own little silos. Um, and I'm drawn to people with very different worldviews from me. And I like to know where they come from, what they believe, why they believe what they believe, um, more out of curiosity than I think people sometimes do approach conversations about faith.
It is absolutely unique. And I love that you bring this perspective into this conversation. I find it very noble and intriguing. And it just says a lot about who you are as a person that you care so deeply about this. I find that
Mhm.
a lot of people who are the kind of people that want to promote voices on the margins or people who have suffered in some way or just voices that have been diminished or silenced have
Mhm.
often had experiences of their own of that type of suffering and some version of it. Is there anything in your background that you think led you to this point specifically?
Mhm. Well, I mean, probably the most obvious, if I were to psychologically analyze myself, would be that I have a vocal disorder. And the early treatments for that disorder actually muted me. So I had
Mhm.
no voice at all for a month at a time. And then I could whisper. And then I had this voice that I did not love and that I did not think was worthy. But it was all I had to go on. And I just kept going back and going back for these treatments. And I've lived the experience of silencing and, in a way, choosing silence, and have also kind of had to come to terms with the fact that this is the only voice that I have. And if I don't use it, then my views will not be out in the world. And in a metaphorical way, I think I'm very drawn to people who have felt silenced and who have felt that isolation that can happen when you do feel voiceless. And then, I do have the ability to help put their voice out into the world through writing. And in a strange way, here I am now. I am a person who amplifies other people's voices, which I never thought I would become kind of a megaphone. But that's kind of, I think, where I've ended up so far.
I love it. I love that somehow, they say our mess can be our message or whatever phrase people use around that. And I
Mhm.
think that we all have parts of ourselves. I mean, some people will say really difficult things to hear and what I would describe as spiritual bypassing or even just toxic theology sometimes, which is that God causes or even allows suffering in order to make us better and like they kind of make this silver lining that sounds really um, awful in a way that makes people feel isolated, as if God
Mhm.
isn't loving, that God would cause that. And we definitely don't have to get into all of that, but I think that psychologically speaking, there is a way we can make choices about what happens to us as humans. Our humanity means that none of us are going to get through this life without some version of suffering, and a lot of us some trauma along the way. But how we can reframe that for ourselves to make a difference for others is really valuable. And I'm so grateful you've done that for yourself and for others. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a few phrases that will send me screaming inside faster than everything happens for a reason, which
Yeah.
I think it's valuable to create narratives for ourselves, to explain those things to ourselves after the fact. And if we're able to make sense of what we've lived through, that can be very powerful and that can compel us forward. But I don't think there's a divine creature or deity dispensing war and abuse and disability just to, see if people get stronger. I think that's asinine and not a very beneficial way to live.
No, it's not. It's caused a lot of pain for a lot of people. And I'm really glad that you have found a way for yourself to let in what's helpful to you and what doesn't serve you to just reject, because I think we all have to do that wherever we are in the world and whatever type of community we're living in. Your book, which is so incredible, and thank you for giving me an advanced copy of it, is really exciting to see. I think that, there's that quote that we often hear, was it Eleanor Roosevelt, that well-behaved women rarely make history, or something like that. And
Yeah.
so your book is along those lines. And one of the things you say in your book is, after the events of January 6th here in the United States, you realize that covering a counter movement led by women to reform the most powerful religious movement exerting political force in our country in our lifetime, white Christian evangelical nationalism, and its spawn, Christian nationalism, you realize there's something really deeper going on there. And so tell us more about that and about this counter movement that's been birthed from these voices of women survivors.
So by January 6th, I had been covering different groups of people, predominantly women, who had been questioning and calling out various forms of Christian patriarchy. And they did this through blogs, they did it on Twitter, they ended up on the news. And through them, I had learned what it means to be quiverful. So having many babies, as people are aware of with like the Duggar family. I learned about stay-at-home daughters. I learned about the purity movement. I learned from women who've been abused and not only ignored when they did speak out, but were reviled. And I thought I was starting to understand a sort of power, and one that wants to pretend God is often on the side of the abusers because God's on the side of that power. And that's just when I was really kind of grappling with like the extent that evangelicalism was trying to exert dominion over women. Then on January 6th, with all of the Christian symbolism and the prayers we saw people making and their Christian flags and the cross and all of what was clearly Christian nationalism, I realized these were threads I had taken for granted and seen as background noise in these pursuits to hold dominion over women. And there was also this hope to hold dominion over the country, and that maybe through women's wombs by encouraging lots of reproduction of many Christian babies, or conversion, or by force. And those threads came together in my mind in parallel. And that's when I think I really saw how the women and children who I've been reporting on were treated as one tool in this large project. And that's around the time I also realized I really need to write this all as a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so hard to fathom some forces that could come together in such uh like a systemically abusive way, like you said,
Mhm.
dominion over women. And I think that's like a really good phrase to kind of sum it all up.
Yeah.
It's not just women, it's also, it's a white Christian nationalism as well. So there's a lot of like, black and brown bodies that are not
Mhm.
valued, and a lot of it embedded in it. But you narrowly focus on women, and I'm so glad that you do, because sometimes when you lump it all together, the women tend to get lost. And so
Yeah.
thank you for focusing on that part of it. You also say in your book that they were in confrontation with a version of faith that didn't respect their autonomy or recognize how much they had to teach, referring to these women. And the
Mhm.
internet granted them a platform when some of their churches did not allow a pulpit. So I'd love to hear your assessment of the damage that this has caused to women in evangelical worlds here in the United States, especially within the white evangelical church, who have been ignored and dismissed and silenced. And what has the church, both men and women, missed out on by overlooking and at times abusing these women?
Mhm. So, something that was very striking for me years ago when I kind of started covering this beat is meeting people who were raised in families that ordered materials for their girls, for their children, from groups like Vision Forum or those raised within Bill Gothard's ministries. Um, and there was this like intense pressure that was built into their toys and into their books, that there was this one mold of what it meant to be a woman. And so if you're a little girl, you should wear these really long skirts and dresses, and you should play with dolls. And there'd be different pages of physical toys and physical activity for the boys, never for the girls. You'd be a certain type of girl, and the girls who didn't fit that mold or didn't feel comfortable with it, often they would be disciplined physically by their parents, which was also encouraged by people like James Dobson. And so they were, on one hand, told this is how you act. On the other, you will feel pain if you don't act that way. And these girls, these women, but their memory of being a girl was how much they wanted to serve God and how much they wanted to be godly. They wanted to be good. So they were given a clear set of parameters for what goodness is if you're a girl. And any movement outside of that came with a sense of threat. And then many, it was striking to me the number who wanted, because they loved God so much, they wanted to be pastors. That seemed reasonable to them. And then they would be told one way or another, no, or laughed at. And instead offered, well, you could be a pastor's wife. That's the role you can fit in. So getting to know so many of them over the years who later did grow up and become these outspoken advocates, they are masterful communicators. And what really hit me over and again was how much better off their churches would have been if they had been valued. If instead of being abused and pushed aside, they had been not just allowed back into the church in whatever way was comfortable, but rewarded and encouraged for wanting to be there, for wanting to be good, for wanting to serve the faith. Um, and I think in many ways, if I imagine this net of people that I've spoken to over the years, who some folks within the church now, see as the enemy, they started not only wanting to be on your side, like they were all in. So
Mm,
what happened to push a person so far? And really, in many cases, they're seen as on the outside. but they're shouting in, let me help you. Let me help the people you serve. They're still trying to be good.
It's so true. I see it too. I feel it. I know it firsthand. I mean, all of the things that you're saying really resonate, and not just from the stories you've written about and the particular people you chose, obviously, with the whole Bill Gothard movement. And, you know, if anybody's watched Shiny Happy People, which a lot of us have, I think it's like one of
Yeah.
the number one Amazon
Mhm.
Prime documentary when it released. And a lot of, I've seen it like twice, maybe three times, but there's so much there. There's so much like you missed the first time. It's just so you almost can't even really believe some of it, even though you've kind of observed it from the outside. And I've known people that have been involved in it too, and that are close to me. And it's sometimes it's so hard for our brains to wrap around something so systemically nefarious, you know, that silences women, that really you know, all down to the kind of toys they play with when they're young, and all of it, just the whole system against them. And you say also in your book, you talk about how abuse is a unique violence when it's paired with faith. And it takes people at their most vulnerable, raw, and innocent, and attempts to dominate a secret place. And there's a loneliness in people's voices as they recount spiritual wounds, whether they come from pastoral manipulation, occult like control, or childhood rape. And so, how would you say that abuse is much more intense when it's paired with faith?
So I think I realized while I was writing the book that I have maybe a unique benchmark concerning abuse. So this I had not intended to include in the book, but during the time I was writing the book, both of my parents became very sick, and I became the primary care coordinator for both. My father was an alcoholic, and I did not have a pretty home life, I'll put it that way. So while I was writing the book, a lot was bubbling up for me personally. And it was interesting because on the one side, I was having a lot of memories that were just at the surface due to circumstance. But as a reporter, it's my job to be objective. And so I had this like new, I don't want to use the word rich, but I guess more complex, more nuanced understanding of abuse. And it helped me as I was thinking about the stories of the people I had interviewed to see, yes, they experienced abuse, but what I heard from people like Krista Brown and others is that extra layer on top where they experienced abuse, whether it was from their parents or a pastor or a husband. It was also within their worldview something they believed was sanctioned by God. And like I didn't attend a church with young people who had families similar to mine where what I was living with was sanctioned by God. That was not my reality. Um, and so meeting these people who lived through sexual abuse, who lived through abuse at home, who had seen violence, they had that, but they also had this weight that God was supposed to be there. And they were told, yeah, God's there, and God's on the side of your abuser. And that thing that you can hold on to in your darkest moments was taken from them, and it was warped, and it was used as a tool to control them. And that to me became a very sharp differentiator. And I think that's that's why spiritual abuse can be so damaging, because you have multiple things to recover from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm so heartbroken with you about what you experienced as a child. When I read that part in the book, it was just really heavy and so vulnerable for you to share that. And no child should have to grow up that way. It's just, it's awful. I'm sorry you were mistreated like that. And I do think that it gives you a sensitivity as you hear the stories, having walked through something parallel. But I also agree with you when you say that the layer of spiritual abuse on top of other types of abuse is its own thing. And being an abuse survivor myself, people often ask, like, as I had emotional, verbal, psychological, financial abuse from my megachurch pastor when I was on his staff. Um, and there was a lot of kind of labor abuse going on all the time as well. But
Mhm.
it's the spiritual abuse that was the hardest part, and that's been the hardest part in the therapy, because I hear this quite a bit from even some of the sexual abuse survivors in the SBC. I think the assumption is that one moment, that one act, which may have happened on multiple occasions, is the
Mhm.
hardest part. But so often it's the spiritual abuse that was on top of it that is the most confusing and hard, and the spiritual abuse of the community that re-traumatizes and gaslights and says this man would never do what you're saying, and that kind of
Mhm.
comment can be so hard when they it's like there's this version of hero worship that you see where they have to have their
Yeah.
leaders, their megachurch pastors, their politicians, like Trump, be infallible. So don't bother me with the
Mhm.
stories of abuse that Trump or other megachurch pastors, for example, may have done. Just the head in the sand, because I need this person to be infallible, because my whole belief system, whether it's in politics or a celebrity pastor, relies on the fact that he's never did anything wrong and would never do anything wrong. And so it really crushes the women that you've interviewed for this book.
Mhm.
Um, how have you seen that kind of crushing playing out, and what are any patterns maybe that you've noticed?
So, um, when I tell people outside the evangelical space stories of men, often pastors, who confess to what they've done in front of the church, and not only are they forgiven, they're given a standing ovation, and that is not an isolated event. Like, that has happened over
Yeah.
and over. It's a trope at this point.
Yeah.
That people find hard to believe. Um, but then if they ask what happened to the survivor of abuse, and I tell a story about someone like Krista Brown, who's spoken up against Southern Baptist Convention for a decade and a half, and how she's been harassed in an ongoing way, treated as someone that, like, the devil is manipulating, because she kept speaking up, not to hurt the church, to
Right.
protect the children still in the church and the people still in the church. Or Jules Woodson, who I've seen repeatedly chewed up online, the people who are doxxed and threatened. It's interesting. People have less trouble believing that. They have a little trouble believing, oh, church would do that. But
Mm.
it is standard fare for women when they do speak up about abuse. So I see those, like, the contrast there and those
Mm.
responses is really telling to me.
Eh, That's so fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's not that we don't understand victim blaming in our society at large. I mean, that's pretty common. We even have the literal witch hunts, the witch burnings in history. I mean,
Mhm.
I was in Scotland last year and, at Edinburgh Castle, and there's the little place like it's just a witch burning. I was seeing that at the same time I was reading about myself in the news while I was speaking out
Ugh,
about Saddleback and Rick Warren and Andy Wood, and realizing, oh, I guess we still burn the witches, but we just do it on Twitter, right? So,
yeah,
but it still
yeah.
happens for women to speak up. It's like there is this male patriarchal, powerful bro club, and it's very pervasive, that doesn't want, and I'm putting this in quotes, like nosy women sticking their nose in where it's nobody's business. Like, just let
Yeah.
us do our thing and stop talking about it. But I find that women who have never really been fully a part of that power have always been a little bit on the margins, observing it as an outsider while being inside, often care so very deeply about the mission, and therefore they whistleblow even at great personal risk. And so you've
Mhm.
interviewed some brave women. Have you observed that too?
Yes, absolutely, and that's uh, it's I don't wanna say I take anything personal out of these interviews. I don't wanna sound like I'm collecting emotional rewards or something, but there's something, knowing people like this exist, and knowing that it's more than one person, and knowing that many just keep going, even despite the personal costs. It's staggering to know that exists in the world.
Mm,
And so I'm a person who grew up with kind of a faith that was deep and was allowed to be expansive, then it became very narrow, and then it broke. So I'm careful to say what I believe in,
mm,
but there's something astounding that a core part of me now cannot forget, having known the number of people who've faced a large institution. And it's not only women, like there are so many different categories of people.
mhm,
LGBTQ people right now are in a horrible confrontation on every flank. And knowing that the perseverance of human beings when faced with institutional power that is so much bigger than them, because they have a clear conviction of what is right and that
mm,
human beings should be valued. That's something, I guess, if I have to believe in something, I believe in that's
mm.
worthwhile and that can change a person's life to know about.
So true. It's a very powerful and inspiring type of transformation. It gives us a lot of hope, even against all odds in a David Goliath situation, right? That there's still
Mm-hmm.
hope that voice can make a difference, especially if other voices elevate that voice and promote like you're doing. You also observed online as you were observing a lot of these women who didn't have a pulpit but could go to Twitter, for example, in the
Mm-hmm.
way that hashtag Me Too and hashtag Church Too really took off, right? So you say in your book that you saw that this revelatory power of the online reckoning in recent years is that the sheer number of people who believe themselves a solitary wounded being until, thanks to the internet, they suddenly became aware of an overwhelming reality that their wounds were common. And perhaps the thing worse than being wounded and alone is knowing that you're a part of a community of wounded and that those you trusted with your soul knew and didn't care enough to stop
Mm-hmm.
it for any of you to help you heal. What's this all about, and how can faith communities do more to reform this situation?
Oof, I have a laundry list. Um, so the movement from feeling alone to realizing it's not just you, that is a theme I've seen over and over. For me, it's been very telling reading the old blog posts about sovereign grace, for instance,
Mm,
and seeing parents realize they were coached to handle abuse cases of their children as they conveyed online in very similar ways across churches within that body. Um, and realizing, one, like that feeling that the parent had that this isn't quite what I want, that that was something worth listening to, but that it wasn't just, if it wasn't just happening to them, it was happening at all these other connected churches. Maybe this is something closer to a policy for handling. And if you have a policy for handling abuse that results in a quieting of that abuse, then you're dealing with a cover up. So
yeah,
that's within one body. But you can also have people like the Homeschoolers Anonymous folks who they didn't go to school. They had friends, if they had friends with the homeschool movement. Their parents were reading similar books, and
mm,
until someone said it online, the way my parents disciplined me, it was very extreme, and it came from these books. Well, that happened to me too, and that really Me Too in all of its forms can be so powerful, and that when you're by yourself, it's very difficult to recognize there's a systemic problem causing these forms of abuse. But once you have enough dots to connect, then you can start to figure out, yeah, there's something underneath this. Um, but there's also, it's painful to see the magnitude And that can be painful when you're inside of it, but it's also painful for people on the outside. And seeing this thing you're told you should trust has been doing something wrong, and it's so pervasive that you have this multitude of voices saying, yeah, it's happened to me too, and it was wrong and it hurt me, that can do a lot to people's faith, whether they were part of the institution or just looking out at a world populated with various institutions similar to their own. It removes trust in both cases.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I do. I think it's very obvious to a lot of people who are listening to many of these survivors of abuse in churches that there is, kind of how we started one of our first questions about this counter movement of reform that's happening. And if you're not listening to the survivors, you're probably going to miss whatever this movement is going to look like on the other side. You have a situation where white evangelical churches are closing their doors in the United States very regularly. And then you have something that looks very different forming on another side. But if your whole approach to what is happening, what kind of reformation is this, what is church going to look like in the near future, and all you're doing is reading white male theologians that you were given in your seminary textbooks, and I say this because those were also my textbooks in seminary in the 90s, and if you're only listening to your male pastor bro club about this, you're going to miss the movement. You're going to miss the beautiful thing that's forming. I get asked a lot, what do you think the church is going to look like here in North America in the future? And I'm like, I don't know, but I know that it's being formed now through the voices of a lot of these survivors who care enough to say and warn about, human flourishing being prioritized. What are you observing about that kind of thing? And does that resonate at all with some of the things you've seen and heard?
So I'm not an optimist sometimes. So I could see things going a lot of different ways. The New Apostolic Reformation has been getting headlines rightly since Christian nationalism has been a topic people are talking about. And I think that's another way this could break down. Like people could say, well, we need to have tighter dominion, we need to have more control, we need to have more influence. On the other hand, my online world is populated by people finding their own way, by people like Levon Briggs, who, she went to seminary. She's someone who probably would be one heck of an in-person pastor, but she does a whole lot using Instagram and talking to people that way. And there's back in like the old days of the internet and people speaking up on the internet, it was the blogs and then it was Twitter. But now it's so diffuse and there's so many different people kind of trying to tap out their own version of what faith can be now, especially since lockdown, that it it could go a bunch of different ways. Like I'm not willing to guess, but I think there are signs it could be beautiful, and there are signs people just might double down.
Yeah, I see those things too. And my hunch is both will potentially happen. Some people might not be willing to call the more beautiful aspects of what's forming, even call it church.
Yeah.
But as somebody who has not only been to seminary, but read the Bible my whole life in many languages and understand, historically what was even happening in the early church, we probably, some people, and especially megachurch, might not call the things they were doing church either, but beautiful communities can happen in various forms. And women have always been at the forefront of these beautiful things. And when you silence women, call them disobedient for not following man-made rules, you're going to end up with something toxic. And that's kind of what you're talking about here. You also say, though, um, in your book, you say women in, recent years have basically been leading this, white evangelical church in the U.S. I remember when I was in Singapore, in the years surrounding Trump being elected, and the data started to show, like from Barna research and stuff like that, women were starting to really leave the church in droves. So even before I relocated to North America in 2019, this was already on my radar. Why are women leaving? And so even before COVID, obviously COVID really ushered that in further. But you say that you found female rejection of faith to be sort of this canary in the coal mine for the future of religion and the church in America. And so why have so few wanted to write about this and even center women in order to address this in the churches, do you think?
I have no idea. This is a mad obsession of mine, and it has been for at least 7 or 8 years. First, it was that millennials are leaving the church, and I immediately went to the gender breakdown because I'm right at the cusp of Gen X and millennial. And I left the church. Who are these other people? Why are they leaving? And so I started reading sociology of religion about women and secularization, or at least women leaving the church or leaving faith. And historically, except in Sikhism, women are traditionally more religious than men.
Right.
And in the American church, they are often the ones who get the babies baptized. They run Sunday school. They make sure the family goes to Sunday school. They run the fellowship coffee hours. They do the pancake breakfast. They do all the thankless work that glues the community together and makes it somewhere that you feel like you belong. And when women stop showing up, and it's not just evangelical women, it's Methodist, it's across the board. When the women stop showing up, you lose the lifeline to the next generation of believers. And you also lose some of the glue that binds all these generations together. If you are someone cynical and you only think about the church as a numbers game, you'd be pretty foolish to ignore the fact that women are leaving, let alone to allow for systems to drive them away and then traumatize people about returning to church. But if you care about the church as an entity beyond those numbers, and if you value the people, I don't understand why this isn't, sending up like red flags and warning flames. There should be a panic. And I don't know if that is because some of those women who are leaving are the irritating ones who used to be so loudmouthed and critical, and thank gosh they're gone. Um, or if it's people just don't care. I don't know why. And it's something I'm desperate to write more about because it's been really on my mind for a while.
Yeah, it is a good question. I think that curiosity will lead us to the knowledge somehow. And one of the things I observed when I was on staff at a megachurch here, as I was a pastor working with Andy Wood, who's now at Saddleback, and when I started to observe as one of the associate pastors that our attrition rate on staff was high, and that we had a lot of people leaving the church out the back door, I tried to bring it up and it was very quickly shut down. Like, we just don't talk about Bruno. And then I found out Andy and his wife both would cut people off social media when they left the church. It was very much head in the sand. I don't want to know why people leave. I just really was so confused by that in a church that the mug was all about everybody's welcome here. The whole message is everybody's welcome here. So there was a rolling out the red carpet for you to enter, but it was a very like secret known secret on staff almost, that the back door was wide. We just ignored it. And I really didn't think it would take a whole lot for us to do basic exit interviews of staff, or even a version of a follow-up survey of people who left. But it became very obvious that was not something he wanted to know, and was systemically shutting it down. So I don't know if there's a correlation between that and maybe other megachurch pastors, or even just, Christianity in the US in general, if that's sort of a thing. People just don't want to dig into that. It's too painful. I'm not sure why.
Or I don't see hearing that. I wouldn't think too painful. There's a degree to it. Like Rick Warren is a perfect example of this. He loves setting his numbers. Like your numbers of people coming in, the numbers of people you're attracting, that shows your success. That shows your charismatic leadership. And that also implies God is on your side. If your story is, yeah, they're coming and then they're rushing right back out the door behind me, and you have a totally different set of numbers, and your success isn't so great, that could lead to uncomfortable questions about whether you're that successful and whether what you're doing really is receiving God's favor. I don't know, but that's a question I would raise.
Yeah. Well, I know what it feels like to raise a question to a megachurch pastor. That's what led to much abuse on my part, but I think that that's not unusual. I mean, women asking questions is something people trying to uphold this image management and patriarchy and over domineering of women essentially are not going to stand for. But thank you for being a person who is inquisitive, who's curious, who wants to find the knowledge and has written it down. Thank you for all your writing as a journalist and your investigative reporting. It's so crucial, I think, in a situation like what we have in the SBC right now. I say we because even though I'm not a part of it, I was for so long, and so I'm still working through some of my complicity, as like all of us have to, and it's not easy. Asking myself questions, giving myself self-compassion, all of it is kind of a hot mess at times, but I'm determined to work through it even now in ways I have influence. But I think that I'm so grateful for the Department of Justice getting involved, because in a situation where you can't question on the inside, or certain questioners get called Jezebel or treated like Krista Brown when she's trying to just warn, we need somebody. We need investigative reporters. We also need religion reporters who aren't in cahoots with the Rick Warrens, who's very influential. So even, we have Baptist News released a new article on him this week, and didn't have anything about his cover-up of abuse that he did for his successor, Andy Wood. It just paints him in a way that makes you want to worship him as a hero, and makes him look infallible. And that's not the kind of religion reporting we need. We need religion reporters like you who are willing to just expose the truth, because the truth sets us free. So thank you for being on today. Thank you for the work that you do. I'm going to have you hang around a little bit after this, and we'll do one more question for our Patreon supporters about, we're going to mix Bill Gothard, Krista Brown, and what it means to be a Jezebel, all in the same question. So
Great.
yeah, thanks for being on today, Sarah. And how can people find your book, Disobedient Women, and more of your writing?
So the book, I feel like I'll get in trouble if I forget one of the stores that's selling it, but it will be at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, bookshop.org if you want to buy it from a local retailer. Basically, it's anywhere that you know how to go buy a book, you should be able to go buy this book. And if you have trouble finding it, my website is just sarahstankorb.com, and there are links, and you can find me mouthing off on Twitter as politely as I can, and other options for finding the book.
Love it. Well, I love seeing what you write on Twitter, and sometimes, you don't have to be polite. Disobedient Women is once again how we started, right? It's
Yes.
Being tone policed is something we've all experienced as women, and sometimes just the cold hard facts are what need to get out there. So thank you for being that kind of person, and the facts are compelling enough. So thanks for writing them. And Please reach out to Sarah to follow her writing. Please buy her book, Disobedient Women. I want it to get into as many hands as possible, and I'd love to hear how you're interacting with her stories. Thanks for being on today, Sarah.
Thank you.